next up we have Beate Schirrmacher, who will be talking about performative plots and medial performativity.
So, disturbing plots. After the keynote today, you could maybe also call it deformed plots. And I will try to explain what's going on in the fiction and the place of Jelinek and Vrass with the concept of a kind of medial performativity. Both Elfriede Jelinek and Günter Vrass are known to be or to have been provocative authors. They have created fictional plots disturbing in many ways. I will argue that this is due to the fact that Vrass and Jelinek are dealing with language in a performative way. Both authors tend to foreground the materiality of language, which results in what I would like to call medial performativity. That becomes increasingly relevant the more we perceive and discuss language not only as a sign system, but as a medium. I will show you some examples from Jelinek's novel The Piano Player and Vrass's novel Too Far Afield, and I will explain how the texts highlight their own materiality and therefore mediality. Or I hope I will manage. Anyway, we tend to look through the media we use. A medium only draws our attention to itself if it is dysfunctional. If, for instance, the computer isn't working like I expected it to do. In this case, the medium's materiality gets in focus and communication is disturbed. In the foregrounding of materiality, Sibylle Krämer points out mediality and performativity connect. For intermediality explores how materiality takes part in processes of signification. And performativity implies that production of meaning in a performative perspective cannot be divided from bodily material presence. Which is the reason why convenient dichotomies like signifier and signifier, word and action, performer and work appear as inseparable in a performative perspective. While Austin pointed out how word and action cannot be told apart, Erika Fischer-Lichte's approach to performativity stresses how materiality and corporeality might signify. This corporeal performativity, as Sibylle Krämer calls it, that meaning cannot be divided from material presence, leads to a medialization of performativity. However, this has been difficult to pin down in language, for we do not know whether we should focus on signification and immaterial meaning or medialization and materiality. So, how might medial performativity in fiction look like? Sven Erik Larsen has reflected on this. He has explored how narrated performance in the text may interact with the self-reflexive performativity of the text. He noticed that if the borders between the plot and the discourse are blurred, this interaction of different kinds of performativity weakens the representational mimetic character of the plot. This creates an uncertainty in interpretation because questions arise. Where does the performance in the diegetic world end, and where does the performative comment start? This leads to uncertainty about what is actually really going on in the diegetic world. This uncertainty can be spotted in the reception of both Jelinek and Vrass. Elfriede Jelinek's texts are usually described as self-reflexive, where every word is deconstructed in or deconstructs itself in a literary discourse. But at the same time, when Mireille Tabar explores gender performance in Jelinek's play Illness or Modern Women, she feels compelled to stress women actually appear as vampires, mothers actually are child-devouring monsters, and at the same time, she conceives the characters shown on stage as signifiers or flown on stage as gruesome objects, things or bodies. Whence this need to stress that something on the stage is more real and is still fact of part of the performance, and how does a signifier on stage look like? Vrass's work is described as extremely visual, concrete, and occupied with sensual details. Here the problem seems to be the opposite. Scholars soon spoke of an autonomy or a rule of objects in Vrass's fiction. abstract processes Georg Just feels compelled to stress are part of the plot as real objects. But how can some objects in the diegetic universe be more real than others? Not only in Grass's but also in Jelinek's texts, objects appear to be let loose. They gain meaning in some way that is acknowledged in reception but causes trouble in description. Confusion appears to arise about the role of what in Saussurian linguistics is referred to as signifiers, which appear to gain some independence, creating meaning of its own. Both signifiers flown on stage and rule of the objects seem to insinuate that not the immaterial concept, but that the material manifestation of the binary sign is taking over the process of meaning. This unruliness of signifiers, however, is connected to the Saussurian dichotomy. So the question might be whether Grass's and Jelinek's texts highlight characteristics of the sign that the Saussurian model does not pay attention to, as iconicity and indexicality. Let's now turn to Jelinek's novel, The Piano Player, the piano teacher. Sorry, I always mix it up. Erika Kohut is a failed pianist and a strict piano teacher, and the protagonist. She passes on the same relentless training she herself had to endure, and her sexual life is restricted to voyeurism, autoaggression, and sadomasochism. Her student, Walter Klemmer, tries to make her his sexual conquest, but he responds to her fantasies of bondage and dominance only by actually raping her. A piano teacher has long been understood as mostly dealing with gender identity and sexual perversion. However, what's interesting here is that the novel connects performance of music with performance of gender in interaction of performative levels, and music performance aggressively attacks the body. Performing music in the novel is often described with metaphors related to the household. Erika is said to correct the Bach, she mends and patches it, or she lectures in a regular knit-to, purl-to on Beethoven. The public listens to the intricate crocheted patterns of contrapuntal tissue. Performing music thus appears, as Carl Ivan Solibach has pointed out, as performing gender. These metaphors in the text bring out the still prevailing gendering of music. Through literary discourse, Jelinek exposes the fact that the playing of music has been used to define female gender. But there's more going on. Throughout the novel, music most violently affects the performer's body. The crocheted patterns mentioned above are in fact the whiplashes of the intricate crocheted patterns of contrapuntal tissue. And music hurts the body. For example, painful steel strings of the violin. The violent relation between music and body is mostly established by metaphors. The recitals publics wants thrashing and a pile of passion. The successful performer appears inhuman, resembles a mechanical instrument, a clockwork or a meat grinder. And the five black lines of the staves are said to be a grid system that has hamstrung Erika in an unterrible net of directions, like a rosy ham on a butcher's hook. Finally the performer herself gets aggressive. Boarding the tram, adolescent Erika on her way home from music lessons is detonating among her fellow passengers like a fragmentation bomb. These violent metaphors, I argue, connect to the plot, to Erika's autoaggression on a dependence on BDSM sex. Her perverted sexuality has been interpreted by Powell and Bethman as an attempt to escape the female gender role, as sexual perversion as a way to gain the Lacanian law she fails to reach as a pianist. This may be so in one way, but they do not address the disturbing fact that Erika's revolt to gender role is achieved by the rejection of the female body, that what we see in Erika is a deformation of the female body. To explain this a bit more, The metaphors from the reproduction sphere from the household that I showed you first are only found in the narrational discourse. Erica is never seen to cook, to do actual needlework. Present in the diegetic universe is only one part of the metaphor, the one Max Black calls the primary subject, for example, Erica playing Bach. The conceptual subsidiary subject, however, needlework, is in these cases evoked in the narrative discourse. However, the subsidiary subjects of the violent metaphors, the whips, the gags, the instruments hurting the female body, appear in the plot. When the staves are called a grid system that has hamstrung Erica, we have a metaphor. However, when Erica in detail describes her sexual fantasy, this creates far more uneasiness, as she really, actually asks to be bound, gagged, and not only in a playful but in a quite abasing way. She asks her would-be lover that he ties her up with ropes and also the leather straps and even the chain, hog-tie her, bind her up as thoroughly as he can, use a rubber hose to stuff the gag so tightly into my mouth that I can't stick out my tongue. Please use a blouse to increase my pleasure, tie up my face so skillfully and thoroughly that I can't get it off. And these are only short abstracts or extracts. The aggression towards the own body is thus not only referred to in metaphors. Erica really cuts her vulvar's labia with a razor. She really injures her two talented students' hands with glass shards. Tram passengers who are said to peruse on the composer's inner pain are brutally hit by Erica's music instrument cases. As we read all this in a part of a fictional plot, we are forced to imagine what language otherwise only refers to. And this really is disturbing. For if we interpret Erica's behavior by means of causality and coherence, like we used when reading a narrative plot, we get the story of an perverted individual which we refuse to identify with which we reject and criticize. If we, however, ask not what the plot mimetically represents, but what it presents, Erica, like a performance artist, visually, bodily demonstrates the effect of the musical discourse on the female body. From what we heard this morning, you might ask whether the point is not what that it's between the metaphors and the plot that these two levels are felt to engage with each other. It's not the one or the other, but this kind of feeling that this connects in some way or the other. Let me briefly show you another completely different example. Günter Grass's novel To Far Afield was literally pulled to pieces by the most influential German critic, Marcel Reich-Ranitzky. The news magazine Der Spiegel showed Reich-Ranitzky to actually, there we again tear apart the novel, while the headline stated that Reich-Ranitzky thought Grass to have failed. Why was that? The novel's protagonist, Theo Wuttke, feels himself predestined to reperform the life of his idol, the 19th century novelist Theodor Fontane. He resembles a bit Don Quixote in this, and his Sancho Panza is a member of the Secret Service Stasi, called Hoftaler, even he a kind of literary double, as Grass has borrowed the police spy from a colleague of his. The novel was widely attacked mainly because of the protagonist's constant parallels of reunification in 1990 and the unification of Germany and the foundation of the Reich in 1871, which led to 2 world wars. So that was found to be criticizing reunification. But apart from this discussion about unification, Reich-Ranitzky and others found the novel poorly written. The protagonists were criticized as lifeless, too constructed, bad copies of the original, two-dimensional, lacking individuality. The protagonist's strange nature appears more understandable if we turn to the drawings that always accompany Grass's writing process. Also, in this drawing, Fonti and Hoftaler appear sketchy, two-dimensional, flat, which is exactly what the literary characters are criticized for. In the drawings, however, we recognize shadows. This is not merely a fast sketch, but this is deliberately done, as it deviates from the more realistic and detailed style of drawing Vrass usually has. So, these two-dimensional protagonists, I argue, are an example, or better the result, of Vrass's writing process. As Vrass always switches between writing and drawing, he says that is checking on verbal metaphors by the means of drawing them. These particular drawings can be seen as a way to check on the literal metaphor to shadow by drawing. Therefore, the literary doubles and shadows appear in the text not only with some, the most familiar, but with more characteristics than usual of a shadow, in the form that the character in the plot appear flat or sketchy depending on their idols not functioning on their own. So, like Erika Kohut's sexual perversion, this is once again a kind of deformation of what we usually expect in a narrative plot. Fonti's two-dimensionality demonstrates the metaphoric iconicity of language. The plot, I would say, appears as a symptom of what it is criticized, of what is criticized in discourse. As I've pointed out before, metaphors in literary discourse often operate on both the diegetic level and in narrative discourse. Only part of the metaphor appears virtually in the diegetic universe. This means that in narrative fiction, the metaphor appears to have a similar structure to the as the binary sign structure of a material signifier. Testing the materiality of metaphors is therefore a way of reflecting the materiality of the linguistic sign in narrative fiction. It brings out the basic iconicity and metaphoricity of language with, which Lakoff and Johnson have shown, and Lars Elleström discusses further. And this might be the reason why Mireille Tabar feels the material part of the sign, the signifier, to take over the process of signification. And you might even be stressing the point about the process here even more. It's not about what it turns out, it's about the process. You could also say that the plot spells out the metaphors, that they literally, actually wrap in what we tend to overlook. Confronted with this disturbance in narration, critics have blamed the authors of failure or of perverse imagination. Instead, I argue, we have examples of medial performativity that we now can describe with and we now can describe its disturbing potential a bit more. We find an interaction of levels of performativity, which leads to emergence of levels of presentation and representation. Metaphors are felt to materialize, which force us in the plot to visualize what otherwise is only conceptually hinted. This leads to a disturbance in communication, as we cannot use our usual way in interpreting the narrative plot. And if you prohibit the creation of meaning, Sibylle Kremer points out, this is perceived as linguistic violence. Medial performativity thus is perceived as a violent act towards the reader or the spectator, and therefore the reader, the public, the critics are compelled to react in one way or the other, which is the reason why medial performativity is a way to do things with art. Thank you.